Okay, guys, we're gonna start now. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm Geri, president of AIAS Pratt chapter and the coordinator of AIAS Pratt lecture series. This is our second lecture, and I'm very honored and glad that Saul Kim is giving us this lecture tonight and has been supporting us in reaching the goals of our chapter, building a sustainable platform for architecture students inside and outside of Pratt. We're also joined by Professors Richard Serak and Scott Sorensen from ITL, who have been extremely supportive of what we are trying to accomplish in many different ways. They also kindly allow us to use this space and use this great facilities. I also want to thank all of our chapter's board members who have been hardworking, innovative, and have fun to work with. Regine, Kelvin, and Valeria and Maddie are here with us today. Lastly, Valeria, the vice president of this chapter, and Maddie, our professional practice committee director, will lead today's lecture as moderators. So from now on, I will hand it over to Valeria.
Thank you, Geri. Hi, everyone. My name is Valeria. I'm the vice president of AIAS Pratt chapter, and we're thrilled to be joined by many incredible professors who support us on a daily basis, and of course by the student body at Pratt and even outside of Pratt, which is super exciting. We hope this lecture series serves as the beginning of what AIAS is all about, enhancing leadership in design, community, and most importantly, learning from young professionals such as Saul Kim, who are definitely making a change and making a difference in the design field. With this said, I am pleased to introduce Saul Kim as our guest speaker for tonight's lecture. I bet most of you know about him. He's famous with the Architecture Anomaly series, as you all know. And he is currently in the Domestica structure and shared his background and his motivations and small tutorials of Anomaly series. I will now pass it on to Saul's presentation, and we will have a Q&A session afterwards. During the discussion session, please turn on your camera if you can and raise your hand if you have questions. Thank you so much. And Saul, thank you for being here. You can now take it on.
Thank you. Thank you for maybe an introduction that's a little too kind. I'm Saul, and I will be showing you a few of my projects today titled Architectural Autobiography. Let me just share my screen. Is it on? Can everyone see it? Oh, can everyone see the screen? Thank you.
Huh? What did you say?
Yeah, minimize the zoom bar so we don't see it.
Yeah.
Oh, where can I do that? Hide video panel?
Click small button on top.
Can't find it.
Okay, so you got rid of one now.
You can also.
Sorry, let me reshare the screen.
Yeah.
Okay. Take your time. I think people's still coming in.
Yeah.
Is it still on? Is it still the same?
Yeah. You can also you can hide the annotation bar.
Yeah, I don't have annotation on though. Let's see, limitation for others. Is that fine?
It keeps popping up.
Yeah, we still can see it though.
All right, it's not gonna cover much of the content, so I'm just gonna go ahead.
Okay.
Okay. So I've titled the lecture Architectural Autobiography, and I'm trying to imagine this as an account too, as of what I've learned, what I'm interested in, and a reflection of why I am who I am today. And if it's written till the end of my career as an architect, this is probably the first chapter which would contain the academic journey and the thoughts that were given after. This is a timeline of my architecture education, starting from Singapore to SciArc from an undergrad degree and to GST from a master's. And each school has a very different perspective and direction for architectural education. And I believe there was some sort of a buildup of knowledge and interest from these different environments that allowed me to pursue a kind of specific discourse in architecture today. These are some of the main projects I've done from the school, but I will show you 4 projects from different periods of my education and share with you some of the interests that I've developed while studying in different schools. The first project is titled Lumiere. This is back in 2016. The school in Singapore was heavily focused on pragmatic issue of architecture. We talked about the site, the environmental concerns, structures, and building codes. So everything had to kind of be resolved, and there was no cheating. So we did have opportunity to design, but we spent most of the time developing and resolving the project. And really quickly, the site was located along Orchard Road, and it's a downtown Singapore, a shopping street, and we had to deal with the program of artisan and that relates to the back of the site on the smaller scale fabric here, and the commercial programs that relate to the main shopping street. And among the numerous site analysis, I wanted to focus on the play of light and shadow as a strategy of making space and how light could potentially be used to mediate different programs of the building. So 2 voids are carved at specific angles facing east and west for optimum lighting. And the void merge at the bottom to create this kind of common open program, which is the exhibition gallery, where artisans get to display their artwork and the public gets to view it. And also the spaces are arranged according to its function and lighting requirements. So the light focuses on the artisan's workshop on the right side in the morning when the sun's intensity is low and when the program is most active, and when the sun is at its peak during the midday, the void is kind of just protecting the programs from the harsh weather because this is a tropical climate. And as the sun starts to descend, light focuses on the commercial programs on the left during late afternoon when the shopping streets get actually activated and become more crowded. So it forms a kind of narrative between movement of light and shadow and the movement of users of different programs. And there is a kind of a phenomenological and environmental aspect when developing the interior spaces, having the right amount of reflection, brightness, and dividing the right spaces, whether that's naturally or artificially lit. And also strategy for operable components that can control light manually. And that was schematic design, but the real challenge was making this thing actually work according to the building and zoning code. So it was in the school's interest to teach the students the entire process of architectural design from schematic to construction. And we had, there were many problems and we had to go back and forth because, first my building was oriented diagonally, which made me suffer a lot when it comes to drawing the basement, let's say. And when things don't work, we destroyed a portion of the project and started over. And that included other problems of ADA, fire rating, escape, and drainage, and so on. It was a lot to handle, but especially when the design isn't a box, and the more specific it got, the more difficult it was to maintain the project at a conceptual level that I had from the beginning. But it all depended on one's ability to develop and execute. Real fun for me was the structures and details, and this is something I really kind of enjoyed, figuring out how things come together in this section, and how the architectural elements get assembled in different ways. In this case is the detail of my facade, trying to invent a natural ventilation gap at the bottom of every level, which was applied to the section of the building. And while the void serves as the heat stack to pull hot air out, and that naturally creates a negative pressure, drawing the cool air from the facade. There are other detailed drawings of that we needed to resolve. There were green roof, facade termination, and skylight termination, and the drainage that follows. I didn't hate doing this at all, actually, because I felt that this is a design and art at a different scale, and it was just fun to see how detail can influence the overall look and feel of the project. sometimes strengthening, but also sometimes ruining the overall concept. And this project was done in Revit, and we didn't know of Rhino. We had to use either Revit or SketchUp, and I believe that this had an interesting influence on the students, including myself, because Revit is all about components and it's the architectural components. And if we use Revit to design something, we're kind of restricted by this predefined structure or materiality or forms of assembly. So it is difficult to think about architectural design in a more conceptual or abstract way. And I believe that having this kind of education as my foundation had an interesting look and kind of an interesting influence on the way I think about architecture today. So at the end of the program, these were some of the main topics that I got interested in, and as they relate to the overarching idea of the pragmatic. Moving on to my next phase is my thesis project at SciArc titled Cross-Contamination. And I described this journey at SciArc as the ontological, meaning that we study the very nature of things within architecture. And at the time, object-oriented ontology, which is also known as the triple O, was still popular. And also, we also talked about the existence and the meaning behind architectural objects, independent of human perception. So among those discussions, I got interested in the topic of layers and their conformity. This was precedent from my fourth year project, in-house by Saul Fujimoto. And it is one that works with three porous layers, hierarchical in size, nested within one another, meaning that they share spatial congruency and consistency. And he takes the advantage of the layer hierarchy to blur the boundary between the outside and the inside. But surprisingly, the sequence of layers did not translate directly to the level of privacy. But as you can see, that the bed is in the centermost layer. So this kind of idea allowed me to rethink about the layer hierarchy and their arrangement. So I was experimenting with a less consistent and spatial congruency by manipulating the layers, forcing them to collide with one another at different points. It sometimes compresses the three layers into a single layer, and that means meaning that it involves compression of time and also space. The way in which you would get into the center is very different at every point, and sometimes you got to cross three layers, but sometimes there are shortcuts. So the project dealt with the idea of ambiguity within layer hierarchy, and while different layers also collide on a same plane to uncover new figures that doesn't exist before. And the play of loose fit of layers here was later seen from a broader context of the topic of fit within architecture. And I categorized the three types of fits in architecture: the perfect fit and loose fit, and lastly, the tight fit. They're expressions of conformity between parts. And let me just show you examples of those. An example of a perfect fit is a crown hall, and there's a mass in the shape of a box, and there's a structure that wraps around it. They're designed to fit into one another perfectly, 100% interaction. And this probably applies to 99% of the buildings out there where parts conform to one another. And then we have loose fit. Eric Moss, in his book, Gnostic Architecture, talks about this helmet head, where normally a helmet is designed to fit a human head inside, but in this sculpture, the inner object does not conform to the shape of the helmet. So there's space between the two objects that has varying tension, but somehow there are also moments between the two, that the alignment at the bottom and the positioning of the openings, they somehow speak of one another, meaning that there is partial conformity, which makes them contradictory but seem like a one piece. And the last one is a tight fit. This is a model of the Nordic Pavilion Expo 70, and the architect is using two elastic messing to fit under this plane that is shorter than its combined height. So it requires them to forcefully change its form in order to fit under this thing. And this allows us to perceive architectural form to be something malleable and flexible, and that can interact in a more intimate way with the surrounding, as they need to recognize and react to the existence of one another. Of course, among the three, I was more interested in the two that falls under the category of misfit. But I was wondering if I can push the idea further by allowing layers of crossing disciplinary arrangement that gives us this investigation that was titled cross-contamination. Back to the end house where we talk about the arrangement of hierarchical layers through the idea of nesting. And there's spatial congruency and order between layers. But I was more interested in this challenging the layering typology by breaking the hierarchy of layers and when these layers are extruded in an unconventional manner and fit into the layer sequence through a strategic interlocking, the understanding of the layer hierarchy is broken. Now you can see that the exterior became part of the interior and vice versa. So the object remains to be congruent at the bottom. The first layer, the layer sequence has changed towards the top. So the outermost layer that used to contain all the three layers becomes partially contained by something that was previously contained. And this kind of self-contradictory gesture seemed to have a potential in generating unique architectural spaces. So I started to think about the application by fitting a staircase in between the layers. I can start to track how one begins to walk between layer number 1 and 2, but ends up walking in between layer number 2 and 3 at the top. And this kind of phenomena seem to be a powerful formal configuration that allows us to rethink about ideas of layers and their territory. The site for the thesis was in LaGuardia, Mexico City, and the program was the US Embassy of Mexico City. And our thesis explored the cross-contamination of layers in architecture and how it affects the boundary between two territories. And as we know, when there's an embassy, the whole site boundary line marks the territory of the foreign country. But we try to challenge this typology by removing the walls of the perimeter and of the site and bring the host country inside of the building. Simply the white layer defined Mexican territory, which contains all the public embassy programs within the building, while the gray layer defined American territory containing private administration office spaces. And this kind of section of the model shows a kind of gradual change of conformity between layers, allowing these various spaces to be generated. And it forces two territory to coexist within the same building, negotiating the spaces that belong to either US, Mexico, both or neither. That means that there are ambiguous moments when one is able to stand on the ground of one country while being bounded by the walls of another. And these both and neither spaces serve as a figural habitable boundary. And if we think about a typical embassy, a boundary between two territories is an implied line that is crossed to move from country A to B. But in this case, in neither space within the building, we're creating a habitable boundary that serves as a mediating ground for two territories. It was important that the technique of space making from the idea of cross-contamination benefit the program that relates to the project. And in order to apply the same technique to a highly specific program and site, the design language had to change drastically from the study model, which had much more simple and direct translation of what that spatially meant. But what really mattered was the application of the technique to a different context, a formal and programmatic context, which was probably the biggest challenge of the project. And the model that cost us quite a bit. I feel that this particular project has one of the biggest influences on the way I think of design today. And it's something that I continue to explore even today and would love to see what that means in the practice. And some of the key interests that I've developed while studying at SciArc, I began to think about architectural design in much more of an abstract way distancing myself from the preconceived notions, becoming more and more fascinated by the incorrect ways rather than the correct ways. So this was a completely opposite of the previous education that I got back in Singapore. Now we move to the GSD, and during the second semester there in 2020, I took Max Cogan and Marilyn Lam's studio. It was a really unique one because the topic was on self-discovery. They put an emphasis on the fact that successful architects out there have the ability to discover their inner interests and have been owning and practicing those interests to make themselves unique individuals with unique architectural styles. And it is through one's analysis of one's life experiences to fully comprehend and discover oneself in order to set a direction for architectural discourse catered to that individual. So this was an important lesson for me, and I had the whole summer break reflecting about what the things I'm interested in, and what is it exactly that I want to pursue as an architect. And that was the beginning of the Architecture Anomaly series. It is where I deposit my thoughts, ideas, inspirations, experimentations, just about anything that I find interesting. And it's all of the thoughts from previous projects I've mentioned have had a great influence. And this is a manifestation of those learning and the development of thoughts that are displayed clearly in the series. Excuse me. There were supposed to be sketches on a notebook, but was a part of me that wanted to resolve and execute each idea with the right dimension and proportion. It is why I kept them so simple and direct. I don't spend more than an hour making each design, because the more developed it becomes, the more specific and predefined it becomes. And I needed them to remain abstract because it wasn't a matter of practicality. In other words, I don't care if it works as a building or not. These work have no context, no site, no program, no scale. And I see them as these architectural objects that are just meant to be studied from afar, only thinking about the thing in itself and the meaning of their existence. The only thing that mattered to me here is the fact that I thought about it, and the thoughts are translated and represented through architectural expressions. And that way, each work becomes a record of ideas along the timeline of my career as an architect. They're simple juxtaposition of ordinary architectural elements made with recognizable parts, like a wall, floor, column, beam, roof, stair, and so on. And it is the familiarity of these elements serves as a setup for the juxtaposition and contradiction. When we see these recognizable elements, they trigger the preconceived notion of how they normally look like, how they are normally used, and what they're normally used for. And through the right manipulation and misappropriation of these elements, it creates something almost surrealistic and anomalous that defies the convention of architecture, whether it's spatial or formal. So I'm trying to make a point that sometimes these ordinary and banal materials can turn into spectacles with just the right transposition and manipulation. And I don't have to come up with aesthetically pleasing geometry that looks good and say, hey, look at me, this is beautiful and interesting architecture. Here I'm not so interested in the term aesthetic. They exist to convey deeply personal ideas and thoughts. I asked the same question Louis Kahn asked his brick. I can ask my wall the same question. Hey, Mr. Wall, what do you want to be? And the wall says, I want to be a floor today. And I say, okay, just bend yourself 90 degrees and you become a floor. Sometimes it's as simple as that. And I ask that same question to the rest of the architectural elements. As they juxtapose, I create more and more of these iterations titled Architecture Anomaly. There are 164 of them. I'm not going to show everything, but the more I create, the clearer it becomes that there are three overarching concepts to the series. The three themes are singularity, conformity, and ruinization. And I will explain these concepts one by one, showing you a few examples from each theme. First concept of singularity relates to the idea of reduction, where I'm trying to achieve architectural versatility through formal manipulation of a single entity. This way I can imagine making an enclosure with a single continuous piece, perhaps understanding the building with only the most essential components. This way it becomes possible to track how it started, what it started as, how it ended, and what it ended as. In order for singularity to achieve versatility, it needs to deviate and oscillate. In the case of this wall that folds in and out, it folds in and out to the extent that it becomes horizontally habitable. And it's important that singularity also need to maintain its recognizable characteristics while having part of it morphed into something different. And it's about finding the right balance between the banal and the contradictory. Sometimes it almost involves this kind of precise surgical procedure, meaning that singularity, even after being cut and bent, retains its overall dimension to go back to what it was before. So it not only talks about what happened, but it also talks about what it was before and the past essentially. And at the end of the day, we should be able to talk about the spatial anomaly that is derived from singularity. And in this case, it's a wall that spirals and creating multiple layers of spaces that are essentially made with a single piece. So conceptually, the wall at the front and the wall all the way at the back, even though these are studies, they're a continuous wall that you don't perceive. But it's a factual thing. And it's supposed to be anti-human perception, but the formal anomaly of these should resonate and trigger phenomenological anomaly. Conformity is the study of way in which parts come together. At the minimum, two pieces of things need to be present for interaction. And the rule here is to not follow the rule of the conventional assembly of architecture. When we think about a wall within a window grid on it, with a window grid, we relate this to the identity of a facade with openings that allow for light, ventilation, view, etc. But it needs to lose that preconceived thinking about what it is and what it was made for. And I can redefine its meaning of existence by transposing something that doesn't belong there. And now it became this new assembly method between a structure and a wall, with a kind of a humiliation and suppression. So it was also about turning illogical ideas somehow logical. Conformity can also happen between several of the same pieces. It's a question about how to perceive this square wall as really four separate surfaces, independent entities, and what happens when I turn a corner with planes that want to remain independent. So surprisingly, this pieces have four sides, but doesn't really have any corners, only edges. And they still mark a boundary of a space, but it gives a feeling of containment, just like a building. But even though these four walls don't even touch one another at any point. In this next piece, which is a little more playful, but there's a slab and there's a circular wall that wants to be put together, but none of them want to go through the surgical procedure of removing part of their own shape. So at least one of them need to change its physical state for the other to fit. And this is yet another kind of assembly that shows an almost anthropomorphic gesture that is kind of familiar to our human body parts conforming to one another. Lastly, I also had the interest in bringing the ground into the conversation, applying the same knowledge and technique. It's a juxtaposition between ground and a truss, one that operates within a system of grid, repetition, and the other that operates much more autonomously. And the way in which architecture here lands on the ground, not really land, but fit and levitate in the air. The architecture passes its role of structure and circulation to the ground, empowering its ability, allowing it to do more than what it normally can do. The last theme is ruinization. And I got interested in this topic of aging. I've divided the topic of aging into two categories, where there's textual aging and formal aging. So textual aging describes a change of the look and feel of the tissue, essentially an outer surface phenomenon. For humans, we have whitening of hair or wrinkles on skin, but for objects, we have decaying and rusting and change of appearance and color. And on the other hand, formal aging describes the change of the overall posture or composition. For humans, we would observe elderly with a hunched back. And for objects, we would see this kind of destruction of its structural integrity. I was especially interested in the idea of the formal aging, which was applied to the scene of anthropomorphic objects. And it's a kind of forceful ruination, and there needs to be exaggeration of mass and its heaviness that allows this process to fast forward. And the act of designing a ruin is an act of fast forwarding time. It's a process of discovering convincing formal gesture and the spaces that are created from doing so. This is probably the only theme that benefits having some sort of materiality as part of the concept. What is so special about having a concrete slab placed above the structure? And like, how did it sag over time? Or is the concrete malleable in the first place? Or is it a deception of materiality? So it's about generating the right formal gesture that reacts with great sensibility to the adjacency of its the elements surrounding whatever that piece was. And sometimes the relationship between the nature of the geometry and the aftermath becomes so apparent that the mark that it creates from the object moving and sinking is not only an invention of a third geometry that never existed in the scene, but a narrative that can rationalize these kind of ecological phenomena. This particular piece is unique in the sense that ruinization happens within a chosen facade, meaning that it starts from almost a two-dimensional idea, where one of the frames within the canvas drops and falls out. However, the frames they're not ornamental, they're accompanied by depth of spaces that reacts upon their movement. And therefore, ruinization of two-dimensional element can still cause a three-dimensional alteration of spaces. This last piece manifests all of the three themes of architecture anomaly, and it is also the most literal one, a packing box placed upside down. The container can be read as a solid volume, and while the flaps can be read as flexible surfaces that can fold in different directions. So there's an idea of juxtaposition between the rigid and the flexible, while still being able to read this as a whole. And now, because the box is upside down, the flaps are in an unstable state, and I can decide how much the flaps fold and determine the height and porosity of the gap in between the flaps. It's a naturally a powerful geometry that gives us countless options to as of how the building touches the ground, how the flaps are architecturally translated, and how the massing above is oriented. The rest of them have different stories to tell, but ultimately the story is an evolution of curiosity and possibilities, and it's a list that I'm continuing to build on today. And through the expression and somewhat an understanding of myself, I can look back and say, hey, maybe that idea came from this era, and maybe that was influenced from this past, or this project specifically came back to me again. It's more evident the more I analyze. And with that, I show you my last project done at the GSD, also my last project in the academia, one that it's reflected my truthful attitude towards architecture. This was more of an urban project with the topic of transposition. And the site was a formal Tsukiji market in Tokyo, which no longer exists today because it had moved to a nearby area in Toyosu, which opened in 2018 and has taken over the role of the distribution hub. And I wouldn't get into the history of it too much, but the architecture and the significance that it reflected a specific timeline of Tokyo So it was something that we needed to consider. And the outer market, which was located outside the site, is where all the tourists would visit and eat fresh seafood. And the market remains open and alive within, even with the market relocating to another area. So the building's gone today, and it's turned into a large parking area for 2020 Tokyo Olympics. And they plan to create this convention center, a large-scale building in the future. So in the studio, we had the idea of transposition as the topic, and basically placing something foreign onto the site to experiment with the idea of a city and reimagine a kind of a transformative environment of Tokyo. So my interest came from the rooftop conditions of Tokyo, where normally the rooftops of commercial buildings are occupied with building service elements such as water tanks, air conditioning units, and billboards that make up the imagery of Japan. And these building services made most rooftops of commercial buildings in Tokyo unusable. But more recently, the commercial buildings started to reserve rooftop spaces for greenery and public use by removing the billboards and translocating all of the building service elements, and also elevated outdoor spaces that separates human and vehicular traffic sectionally. But it is more difficult to find usable spaces on the rooftops of smaller scale buildings as they have limited amount of floor area. But the building users try to grow plants and do laundry on the rooftop, suggesting a kind of community in the air, visually connected. It's a project that I worked on before the actual semester. I was experimenting with the idea of rooftop urbanism, where intervention of multiple rooftop elements can help to create an elevated community within a block. So essentially, the rooftop spaces connect from one another to form a larger area for various activities to take place. And some of the intervention include outdoor furnitures, pavilions, micro homes, and green spaces. Another interest that I had was the coexistence of various scales and the sectional organization of urban elements in Tokyo. This is Ameyokocho Market in the area of Ueno, where the giant infrastructure, a huge set of train track, create a shelter for small shops and markets to fit underneath. And I interpreted the train track as the new datum, where that can accommodate a completely different program, and that it is possible through sectional urbanism. Another project that I was looking at was Ginza 6 shopping mall, and it's a massive building that takes up multiple slots in the area of Ginza. And in order to keep the storefronts proportionate to the surrounding buildings, the bottom levels of the buildings are divided into smaller masses. And when you actually walk past this building from the street, you don't notice there's this big thing up there because it blends in so well with the scale of the surrounding. And it has a duality in scale. It is able to cater to different sectional conditions of the surrounding. And my project was a speculation of the idea of sectional urbanism, enabling buildings of juxtaposing scales to coexist on multiple grounds. So I call this the super annex, and it operates on 4 different levels: the underground, the ground, the rooftop, and the new ground. And it's an opportunity for various conditions of adjacencies between levels of buildings to occur, stimulating the idea of transformative environment of Tokyo through transposition. And I started to document some of these possible conditions of large-scale buildings interacting with the new ground and the condition of small-scale buildings interacting with the new ground. And the new ground is also made to sectionally curve from one edge to the other, inclining and declining to diverse altitude to find unconventional adjacencies, while addressing the fact that this is a site with waterfront condition that needs to be dealt with a little differently. This is a study chunk model of that idea of sectional urbanism and super annex. And it takes upon the existing elements of Tokyo, the rooftops, the grounds that multiple grounds operating in a different levels, and the juxtaposition of scales of small scale buildings and large scale buildings coexisting in the same plot of land. So the site is imagined to be populated with these small scale buildings at the bottom, while with quite a large amount of public spaces and piers carved out, and then the new ground accompanied by large scale buildings overlaid above the fabric. And it operates with multiple layers of ground surfaces, creating this kind of ambiguous reading to the project. It is almost difficult to read where the original datum is with the intervention of the new ground in the basement. So the new ground stitches itself from one corner of the site and arches over the fabric. It eventually dives into the water, creating piers for various activities. And I developed a portion of the site to show in detail how that new ground is created, created by deviating from the surface of the street level on one end, and the way in which it creates a unique waterfront condition, and how the new ground interacts with the buildings of various scales. This is the overall section of the site, showing all the different levels I've mentioned previously, starting from the life on the new ground, the underground, and the in-between grounds. First, the new ground. As it began to rise, running adjacent to the small-scale fabric and eventually runs over the rooftops, sometimes the roof level meet directly with the new ground, and other buildings from the fabric grow taller in order to connect with the new ground programmatically. The largest scale towers contain a program of office, and they suspend over the new datum, and only the core would go all the way down to the street to blend into the context. The midsection is at its peak, having most of its small-scale fabric covered, and we started calling these thin towers growing from the fabric as pencil towers, where the upper floors are turned into residential units. And larger sports facilities like futsal park or basketball court, they are placed above the new ground to once again not disrupt the street flow below. And the waterfront section shows the way in which the new ground gently slopes into the river and terminates. As it descends, it creates these trays of landscape with a view towards the river, and the way in which it meets the water, the new ground turns into piers that expand and contract during different tides, allowing for different kinds of waterfront activities to take place. The underground of Tokyo is complex and also essential when it comes to connecting subway infrastructures to the surrounding buildings. And often shopping malls expand to underground levels to connect with the street to the station below, with long stretches of underground shopping alleys. And this is an attempt to think about the way in which a street connect to both layers above and below the datum. And the porous layers of ground planes also allow for green spaces to be placed on different levels, once again confusing this kind of idea of where the actual ground is. The space in between grounds takes on the influence from the structure. Apart from the cores of the office buildings, I'm placing large columns that support the large span of the roof. Some are purely structural, and some contain elevators that connect people from the street to the new ground. And there are many instances when small-scale commercial buildings sit directly under the new ground, and the structure provides shade and protects the rooftop from rain, allowing the commercial spaces to expand to rooftops and create this kind of public space accessible by local or external staircases. And I thought that this idea of rooftop urbanism could benefit from if the building service elements, such as the water tank or HVAC system, they could be fitted within the structure of the new ground, which is above the rooftops. And another essential component, which is a billboard, instead of having the billboards occupy the rooftop spaces, I'm letting them hang from the structure, concealing the building service elements. And that just naturally gives more room for rooftop elements to intervene. And I think by having these rooftops filled with the small shops, outdoor furnitures, and greenery, it begins to give life to the previously unused space. And there's catwalks also hanging from the structure that connect from one rooftop community to the other. And the idea is that one can move through the entire project in this elevated in-between space, hopping from rooftop to rooftop, as it separates from vehicular traffic and liberate the density of the street network. So this is an attempt to discover radicality on a different scale. And the whole composition of the project is made with existing urban elements, such as the streets, the buildings of multiple scales, and the rooftops. It allows us to reimagine the urban structure and speculate a transformative environment of Tokyo. That was the last project of my architectural autobiography. Thank you for the attention.